Good afternoon, class. Today we're going to be working on strategies for building our final beautiful finished model. All right, and so I'm going to be walking you through the steps that I would use to go about doing that. All right, so here you can see my workspace set up for the first step. I've drafted the lines that I'm going to need for my model onto my board here. This is my solid piece of material. I've kept it light, and I know it's a little hard to see because I don't want any of them to show up when I'm done. I want to have a nice clean white surface, and so I've kept them pretty light. Okay, now I'm going to start with, I'm trying to see, there's a circle over here, half circle. I'm going to start with that shape. All right, and so the first thing I have to do is draft the geometry that I'm going to use to be able to cut that shape out. All right, and so I've done that here roughly, or not roughly, very carefully, using my compass, using my triangle, taping it down so that it's very precise and accurate, keeping my lines fine so that I can cut carefully. I've also drafted, and again I know it's a little hard to see, but I think you can make out there's a series of lines across here. Those are going to be the heights for my pieces. I've given myself a basic layout of how this is going to go. Here on the flimsy, I've given myself the heights for the different components, given a rough layout of how the shadows are going to work, just so I have a basic understanding of what I'm going to be doing as a reference while I work. All right. So the first thing that I have to do is cut those shapes out. And I'm going to use my X-Acto knife and my metal ruler to do that. Obviously I can't use the metal ruler for the curves. That I'm going to have to do very carefully. Always moving my paper so that I'm working in the area that's most comfortable, and I'll just keep rotating it around. I don't try and go through in a single pass. I just take multiple passes to get through. For my straight lines, I do use my metal ruler, setting it up carefully on that line, and then using my X-Acto knife. Making sure that I always keep my blade perpendicular to my surface, right, at a 90-degree angle, right, so that I don't have any distortion as it goes through the material. Now, right now I'm working with a pretty thin material, right? This is a heavy watercolor paper. It's about the same weight as your Bristol board that you've used. And so it's the lightest weight of the materials that you'll be working with. In some ways, that lightweight makes it easy. In other ways, it makes it more difficult. It's easier to cut through. It's more difficult to glue together. All right. So for yours, you may be using a combination of Bristol board, museum board, and foam core. And each of them will have their advantages and disadvantages. Okay. So I've actually done some of this and cut some of these shapes out already and have them here so that you can kind of see how this would work. And so we can see how these pieces fit together on my base. All right, so those are all ready to start working with. Now, remember, we want to have our light needs to be on our axis of symmetry. We want higher elements towards the light, and so in this case, my light is going to be up here. This element is going to be 1 1/4 inches tall, 1 inch, 3/4 of an inch, 1/2 inch. All right, so I'm just stepping them down in 1/4 inch intervals. Students often build these as solid forms, putting walls on all of the sides so that it stands up, and doing that with each piece. And there's certainly simplicity to doing it that way, but it leads to problems when you try to assemble your overall model. Your dimensions don't work properly, and so I'm not going to do it that way. I'm going to think of it at this element anyway, as a single form with these four pieces coming together in it, and making sure that my perimeter aligns with the edge that is here, that I don't attach to the outside of my shape, even though it's just the thickness of a piece of paper, and in this case not a very thick piece of paper. It will cause problems as I move forward if I don't pay attention to that, and the thicker the material, the bigger the problem. Alright, so I'm going to clear some of these things out of the way, because now I'm moving to a different stage. One of the things I want to be careful of is to keep my tools and my materials clean, and I tend to be pretty clumsy, and when I work with glue I tend to make a mess of it, so I want to be particularly careful. You guys have built models, you've got materials that you like to use, and that's fine. Use whatever you're most comfortable with. I really old school, and I use Elmer's glue, and I use very little of it so it dries quickly and I can move on. Alright, so what the technique that I've been using literally for over 4 decades is that I put some glue on a paper plate, get the rest of my glue out of the way so I don't spill it, and I'm going to use toothpicks to apply it because I only want a little bit of glue so that it will dry quickly. Alright, I'm going to start with one of my quarter arcs. This one is 1/2 inch tall. The inside is going to have this piece, and it's going to be on top of it. It's going to be casting a shadow down. So I'm going to only put the wall on the outside of that piece for now. I've already cut a strip that's 1/2 inch tall, which is the height I need it to be. Now I could do the math and figure out what the circumference of this circle is, and then figure out what 1/4 of it is mathematically. But if I do that, I'm likely to end up with a number that I can't actually measure, right? Something that goes out to 20 decimal places doesn't do me any good. The other thing is that when I cut this shape out, I didn't do it perfectly. No matter how carefully I do it, it won't be perfect. It's impossible. So having a number that is perfect out to 20 decimal places isn't really meaningful when I compare it to the reality of my shape that isn't perfect. So instead, I'm going to measure the length that I need my wall to be based on the shape itself. Right? So I've got just a piece of tape that I attached to my wall because it's hard to be sufficiently coordinated, and I'm going to just tape those together. Right? And now I'm going to wrap my piece along it, and again I'm going to tape it just so I can show it to you more easily. Alright, and so you see I've taped that piece onto the edge of the piece that's going to be the top of my shape. Right. Now what I'm going to do is mark where that is. Alright, so you can see I've made that little tick mark. And I'm going to take these apart and Then, with a pretty high degree of precision, I'm going to cut to that edge. Now, my cutting mat has a grid on it, and so what I'm going to do is use that grid to help me out. I can also tape things down and use a T-square or parallel slide, but I'm going to tape my piece that I'm cutting to its length to my cutting mat using the grid line to keep it vertical, and putting my tick mark at one of my other grid, my perpendicular grid. So now I can use that to keep my cut square. Okay. Now, it's not that this is the right way to do it, it's a way to do it. What is important is that I keep the cut square, right? That it's at 90 degrees to my edge. All right. And so now I'm going to reattach this. I've got some pencil marks. I'm going to keep them on the inside. Now these are little pieces, so they're a little bit awkward to work with. I'm going to use my toothpick to lay just a light line of glue on the edge of my paper. All right, this may seem like it's not going to be enough, but it will be. And the advantage of using just a little bit of glue is that it dries much more quickly. I'm going to take my piece of tape that's already on the other end and get that to hold that point, and then I'm going to take another piece of tape and put it in the middle so that I hold my edge to the curve. All right, and this is already starting to get tacky and hang together a bit. I'm just going to kind of fine tune it, and then I'm going to let it sit. I'm going to put it out of the way and let it dry, right? And that's why I already cut my other piece. Oops, this isn't the shape I wanted it for, which is going to go on this one. All right, because it's always good to have a couple of things going on at once, so that I can let one piece dry and work on another one. Now, this piece I have to pay a little more attention to, in that it has a right and a wrong, right? These half circles or quarter circles, up and down doesn't matter. They're the same thing. But this one does, so I need to make sure I keep my top. And in this case, I'm going to be putting my wall only on this quarter section. Right? Let me see if I can make this line a little darker so you can see it. All right. So that quarter section, because that's where this piece and the piece that I just made come into contact, and that's where there's a 1/4 inch differential. This other piece, the other part of that circle, is higher, and so it's going to have a different situation up here. And so I'm going to follow a very similar technique. I'm going to attach that edge, and my initial one, I want to get, I want to be very precise and careful. I have the line drafted that it meets on, and so I can get that taped properly, and then wrap it around. And I can tape it, or sometimes, I can just hold it well enough and mark that point. Right, so that's right there. Right, so you can see I've made that tick mark, and now now I'm going to do the same thing, cutting to that tick mark using the same technique that I did before. And then I'm going to again use my toothpick to apply the glue to the edge of my paper, just a thin amount, and then lay it on my piece. And again, it starts getting tacky pretty quickly. Hold it for a second. Get my other piece of tape at the other end. My first one came undone. And I want to be careful to try and keep the glue off the finished side as much as possible, but it's one of the advantages of Elmer's is it dries clear. So I don't have to be as careful as I might with some other glues. Alright, and so then while these pieces are drying, I would continue to make some of my other pieces. Okay, so we're going to let those stop for a second and come. Alright, so I have made my 4 pieces that are going to be this quadrant of my design. This first quarter arc, I have the top, I have the wall that we built, you watched me build that, and then I've also built an end, right up here. And that's going to sit right like that. Okay. Then the second quarter arc, that's going to be much taller, I've built, and I've given it its tall side, the top, and then the inside I've made tall enough to go down to the lowest level. It's going to be adjacent to 2 different levels. It's going to be adjacent to this level, this section, which will be a 1/4 inch lower, and then adjacent to this section, which will be another 1/4 inch lower. Right? So I have these two pie shapes that are going to be at different heights. Okay, that second one is actually part of this one. All right, so that will transition between the two. And I've also given it an end because that's going to be visible here. All right, it's necessary there. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is attach these 2 quarter arcs to my board so that I have a stable surface to work with. Okay, so it's important that my initial work be done accurately, precisely, so that I have good lines to work with. Now I'm going to pay close attention to this edge, my left-hand edge, and make sure I'm not hanging out over that at all. Right. Then I'm going to attach this one. And I'm going to put the glue here, where it's going to meet my other edge as well. Right, and then again, being careful to get it in the right spot and keeping everything tightly aligned. There we go. going to use some tape to help hold those pieces in the correct position as well. Get that tape on there first. Be a little better. Alright, so I do have a little bit of time while my glue is drying that I can tweak these a bit and get them just right. So that one is now good, and then do the same with my other one. Okay, so you can see that works pretty well. Oops, this one back where it belongs. There we go. Okay, so you can see that's pretty solid and tight. Now, I could have also built this wall as a single piece. You know, it would have been better to do that, then I wouldn't have that seam, but for this it seemed a good way to go about it. Alright, we'll let that dry a bit. Alright, so these pieces have dried sufficiently, they're stable, and now I'm going to finish up my four pieces. So I'm going to work in a similar manner with my the crescent for the circle. I'm going to put glue on its edge, and then also on this edge, because that's going to attach to the side here. That's why I made that side as tall as I did, so that I'd have a surface to connect to, and made sure it was in the right spot. Right now, this one's a little easier because it's, you know, supported from below, and then I can do the same thing with this one. There we go. Oh, this one just stay where it belongs. There we go. Okay, so my model has dried pretty well. You can see what it looks like, I think. It's a little hard to see the what. There you go. You know, it's hollow on the ends, and the joints are all pretty clean and tight. Now, you know, that seam that I mentioned, you know, it's not ideal, but I'm going to have a piece next to it, so it doesn't matter. Right? It's going to be hidden, so I'm not worried about that. Now, the last two things that I want to show you. This corner has a triangle that's going to be sloping down. All right, and so I know what the shapes of the sides are going to be. It's going to come down to 0 on this edge, this diagonal edge. I know it's going to be 3 inches tall at this corner. So I can build these two sides, but this front plane is on the hypotenuse. And so, again, I could do the math, but I'm going to end up with something that I can't really work with. So I'm going to use a very similar process. I've built that corner. All right, so I have a three-sided shape that would sit right here. Okay, now I built the bottom to it, though I didn't in the previous one, because I need to use this as a pattern, right? And I need it to be stable, right? And I'm going to do a similar thing with this edge, right? I've got this complicated shape with all these stair steps on this edge. I want to make that as a single piece, and I could have measured it, but I know that as I build the model, things get a little off. So I'm going to measure to my model. All right. Now I know the heights on this pretty well. So I drafted out some horizontal lines with my heights, and then I just lay the model down, and using my pencil, mark the critical points, right? And then draft that shape. And I do the same basic thing with this triangle, right? I take it and lay that face flat, mark my points, and now I have a pattern that I can cut to. All right, so I've cut my pieces out. I've got my stair step piece that's going to fit in on the side here, and I can see when I put it up against it that makes a pretty good fit. I'll get that glued in just a second, like that, nice and tight. See? And then I did the same sort of thing for this shape, my triangular prism. This is going to be the face for that. And you see that also makes a nice face. Okay, so you can get those glued up, and all right, so I've gotten my side piece attached, see, and then the face for my triangle, and there you go. I've got my model well begun. Let's see what the lights look like. Turning this off and this off. Let's see if we can see the shadows a little bit. There you go. So you can see it. All right. I will see you soon.